Elle Oshiro is an inbound technical professor at HubSpot with a passion for helping businesses simplify their processes, improve customer experiences, and get the most out of their technology and marketing efforts. So please join me in a warm welcome for today's speaker, Elle Oshiro. Take it away, Elle.
Hi everyone, welcome. So glad to see all you here. And yeah, it looks like we've got a good amount of folks already with us. I know sometimes the Eventbrite can be a little bit tricky to log into, so I appreciate everyone's patience with that. But all right, so let's go ahead and just jump straight into things. So again, our session today is going to be all about AEO. And if you're not entirely sure what that name means or the acronym means, don't worry, we'll have a whole section just about that. And as always, if you have any questions or any, thoughts or comments that come up, please feel free to share them in the chat. Love the audience engagement. And yeah, I'll try my best to have some pauses throughout so that we can have, those Q&A portions throughout the session. Let me pull up the chat to see. Oh yeah, thanks, John. Yep. All right, so a couple of things while we're getting ready and we're still waiting for some more folks to join us. I want to share a little bit about myself, besides the awesome HubSpot approved promo that Sean shared about me, a little bit more about myself. So I'm currently based right now in Brooklyn, New York. So sorry, right now I'm all Knicks. Sorry to the Celtics out there, but I know this is the Boston User Group, so I kind of walked into enemy territory, but had to throw that out there. What do I really am passionate about? What do I do? So currently I'm an inbound technical professor here at HubSpot. I really focus on creating technical and developer educational content, really designed towards developers, programmers, and a lot of folks working the back end of their business or their website. I'm also pursuing a graduate degree in the moment in AI and machine learning. There was a question earlier about, what do we use to summarize 18-page PDF? Believe me, I've done that many times with academic sources and articles. So, you're definitely not alone there if you've done that. And then I also put Chappelle Roan there for the initial iceberg. We're going to do what's your current favorite music artist, but just to save a little bit of time, we'll move forward on that. But mine, I got to throw it out there. Chappelle Roan, probably the best music singer out there since Lady Gaga. So if you have another opinion, please share. I love hearing new music artists. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. I see we have a couple of things in the chat. Carl says, yeah, sorry, I mean, we're in the playoffs, just won game one in a crazy way. So I have to support, I have to stand my Knicks. All right, so what's today's agenda? So number one, we're going to just make sure everyone understands what AEO is and why it matters. This is a fairly new term, and you might have even heard this term be referenced in other phrases or different terminology, but a lot of that's all the same thing. So we'll talk about what that means. We're also going to talk about what makes content more likely to be cited. So what are the specific mechanisms and foundations that really drive AEO and the way that these AI models are interpreting and evaluating content? Then we're going to shift into more practical lenses. So what specific content changes matter the most when you're auditing your content or just creating net new content? Then we'll talk about, take a step back, talk about more holistic, general strategies that you can use to adapt your content strategy. And then we'll finish it up by looking at a couple of real life use cases in an activity portion. So that all being said, some learning objectives. So what I want you all to take away by the end of today. So number one, of course, I want you all to know what AEO is. It's a very broad topic, like I said, but I want to give you just that, really, highlighted, streamlined answer so you have a working definition walking away. We're also going to be identifying practical AEO tips and tricks and just general strategies for your content. And then we're going to analyze this AI breakdown of your current brand and explore very briefly the AEO beta tool that's currently now live in HubSpot. So now Sean's kind of stole my thunder a little bit because he literally read my mind and had the exact same thought for this question earlier. So we kind of already answered this a little bit, but I was initially going to ask, right, who or what is the first thing you think of when you have a question or you have some sort of problem to solve. And I was reading the chat, a lot of folks were saying, of course, Google is probably the de facto answer that most folks would give, especially I would say pre-COVID or all the way up into 2021, 2022, when AI tools started to become really prolific. And the thing is, what I want to highlight about Google is that Google and using these traditional search engines really drive a fundamental facet of user behavior. So, what do I mean by user behavior? So, user behavior refers to those actions, the choices, any interactions that a person is making when they're using a given product, a website, or a service. So when we're talking about something like Google, right, one of the most powerful search engines out there and still is, the very human problem-solving process where, a user would go to Google, they type in their query, and they're presented with this cached list of all these potential sources they can use. And their work is not done yet the moment they enter the query, right? Because the search engine still expects them to basically engage in an active comparison, right? To compare source A to source B, what is more relevant to me, what is not relevant, or just completely useless to me, and then be able to gauge out of the resources that are useful, well, what is the one that I'm going to turn to as a source of truth? So that whole process of user behavior where AI models and AEO comes in is that that whole process is being truncated into just a singular step. And that is the step of, well, entering in a query, right? That's pretty much it when it comes to AI search journeys. And so, of course, ChatGPT, Claude, Anthropic's Claude, Google Gemini. These are by and far the most popular LLMs currently out there. And the difference here with these AI engines is that when users are typing their query, of course, they're not expected to go through the whole, rigmarole of comparing and contrasting all their sources. They're immediately provided this fully synthesized answer. And so they read it, they move on to the next query, and the process repeats. And so all of that expectations that we had that also informed SEO or search engine optimization kind of go out the window when the process behind the user behavior no longer matches up with that search journey. And so, kind of in short, in summary, user behavior has been simplified into that single action of query entries. And so we now have to orient our entire optimization content strategy around that single action instead of that entire user behavior process. And so, of course, you might have even noticed this already. In fact, Google is probably one of the leaders at the moment in terms of noticing the shift in user behavior and these expectations early on. So I imagine that many of you now, when you go to Google, and in fact, I think very recently Google has more aggressively pursued this as their mission and their driving mission for their search engine, which is to provide an immediate AI overview at the very top of your search results page. So that again, you're skipping over that comparison process that the user had to do before and just giving them exactly what they want. And that's because when you see changes in user behavior, you also see, of course, changes in user expectations. And so now Google is anticipating those user expectations by providing its own synthesized answer, even embedded within its own traditional search engines. And so the main takeaway here again is that audiences are increasingly looking for direct responses in their search journeys. And so that change in user behavior creates a real question for us because if before, right, our content used to win attention by, ranking on page one of Google, right? It's one of the first few options that you can click. What does winning, right, or winning in terms of being the primary sources look like when there isn't necessarily a page one at all anymore? Because when we were talking about Google previously, there's not even really a page in terms of what a majority of Google users are doing now. They're not even scrolling down. A majority of Google users are now just looking at that AI overview and then moving on. So the concept of a first page or first page of results doesn't really align with the traditional SEO methods and strategies we used to follow. And so when our audience is not seeing our link in Google search results, And instead, they're just seeing a sentence or two from maybe one of our most popular articles that has itself been paraphrased by the LLM, synthesizing an answer for our users. That is really the behavior we need to follow to address AEO. And so, of course, that leads us to the question, what is AEO? So AEO stands for Answer Engine Optimization. Now, you probably may have seen this terminology used in slightly different formats. In some places, it's called large language model optimization. In some places, it's called generative engine optimization. There's LLIO, GEO, AEO, C3PO, BB-8, or maybe not the last two, those are Star Wars characters, but you get the idea. There's so many different ways of referring to this very new trend of optimization for content. And so when you are looking and researching, especially when I provide you some resources towards the tail end of today, ignore the terminology necessarily. Everything is that I provide is referring back to this concept of AI engine optimization. And so when I was talking about this new generation of AI tools, right, ChatGPT, Claude, etc., they're not really search engines in the traditional sense. Of course, and that might seem very like common sense. But really, if we were to peer into the designs of these engines, the very engineering goals and the architecture that they use are completely different from search engines. Because with a traditional search engine, they are analyzing an aggregated compilation of these results based off of, keyword highlighting, for example, credibility of sources, and a number of other factors, and based upon those factors, ranking them internally. Now, some of that process still carries over to AI engines and these AI tools we're using, but instead, a lot of that process is being turned into an even more granular process, whereby these answer engines are analyzing their sources on not just the entire document or page level, which again is also another facet that informed SEO. They're going so granular where they're breaking it down even by paragraph, and in some cases, even a sentence by sentence level. And so, what does that really imply for us? So when we're talking about answer engine optimization, this is really the practice of making our content easy for those answer engines to do that type of very granular analysis, particularly around reading, understanding, and most importantly, or arguably most importantly, trusting this content. And I do want to mention something really quick on traditional SEO. For years and years and years, this is really the predominant school of thought that we would follow when we were building out content. And I do want to mention that this area of SEO is not irrelevant, right? It's not just completely thrown off to the side. So strategies like keyword research or ensuring like effective site structure, all of those strategies still matter. Those SEO strategies still matter. But these AI tools, because they're largely trained on the open web, all these signals that it's receiving about our content are surfacing in very different ways for these answer engines. So with AEO, it's less about ranking necessarily, which again is primarily what traditional search engines are built upon. Instead, it's a lot more about being chosen as a source of truth in the very first place. Because again, because they're synthesizing an answer for our audience to make it quick and easy for them with complying with their expectations, we also want to identify, well, how do we align our own content to be at the top of being chosen as that source of truth? So, with that being said, every time that someone in our buyer audience is using an LLM, again, large language model, to research a problem that our products or services solve, we want to make sure that our brand is part of the response because again there's so many articles, documentation sources out there on the open web. What's really going to help our articles, our content stand out not just to our readers but to these answer engines themselves, because again that's predominantly what's becoming the primary reader of our content. So that leads us to the next section, right? What makes content more likely to be cited? So we're going to start off fairly simple and talk about specific areas where this is the case. And so, in terms of the characteristics of well-cited content, one characteristic is that these cited sources usually always lead with a direct answer. And I don't just mean that, you have a whole document or a whole page about maybe a singular topic or question. It's where within that single document, every single section, every single paragraph is leading again with that direct answer. A very common thing you'll see, and if anyone has done cooking or search for cooking recipes online, a very common stereotype is you go to Mary's, cooking blog, and the first few paragraphs are, it's about cooking a ravioli, and the first few parts about like her Italian grandpa who like immigrated to the US and had his own little pasta shop. And you're starting to learn about his little neuroses or random anecdotes. And it's not really giving you any context about or details about how do I cook this freaking ravioli. And so that is something that we want to avoid when we're building out content that's effective for answer engine optimization. We're leading with declarative answers and then providing additional context later on. So, because of that, I also want to take a brief moment to talk about how these AI systems are retrieving this info and why exactly it is that we should be leading with direct answers, which is, again, very contrary to strategies around SEO. So, when we're talking about the retrieval stages of an AI system, the very first stage is what's called chunking. And so, basically, what this means is that with these modern AI systems, their source exploration occurs during what's called a retrieval stage. And during the stage, they are splitting these documents or these pages into easily crawlable chunks. And those chunks are really determined by a number of factors, internal factors of these AI engines. Some of them, of course, in fact, are things like keywords and highlighted site structure, like with traditional SEO strategies. But again, they're also based off of these other characteristics we're going to talk about. Once the AI engine has determined what chunks are best for this particular page, they will then try to identify and rank them based off of, again, a number of factors. Again, based off of SEO techniques, but also based off of a number of other factors we'll talk about in just a moment. After this ranking stage, there's what's called the synthesis stage. And during this stage, the AI system is only looking at the very top handful of chunks of that page's content or the number of pages content from that ranked list and then generating the synthesized answer based off of that content. So because of that whole process, not only do we want to lead with these direct answers, but we also want to make sure that our content is specific. Because if these AI engines are very quickly compiling, not just dozens, not just hundreds, but literally thousands of resources in the fraction of a second, right? We want to find some sort of way to stand out from the crowd. Part of that is with specificity. So things like numbers, clear comparisons, named examples. A very common one is just building around declarative statements. So, for example, if I give you the statement something like, um, what's a good one? So, for example, I say something like email subject lines under, let's say, 100 characters perform 12% better than those that don't. Now, compare that very specific citations, that specific statement, with something a little more generic, like, shorter subject lines tend to work well. Now, you can probably imagine which one is much more concrete and easily attributable, and which stands apart from the crowd of other shallower content. So, for a lot of these modern AI systems, specificity is what makes a sentence or paragraph chunkable and then quotable. Additionally, we want to make sure that our content is structured for extraction. So what this means is that this can encompass everything from clear headings to FAQ sections to utilizing common data structures like lists or tables to help our readers, including the AI model, compare data. Now, the great thing about this is that, of course, they're beneficial to both our human readers and the LLMs reviewing them. And for the LLMs, the reason why it's so beneficial to them is it guides them much, much more quicker to those chunks that it can then rank higher within its internal ranking system. Fourth, author signals. So what do I mean by that? An author signal is any information or data that clearly aligns your content with a real human being. Because what's commonly happening now, and some of you may have already come across it during, your searches online, is that there is a lot of, what's called AI slop, or in more academic terms, the academic content I read, noise or AI noise. So there's all this AI generated content that in general is fairly shallow. And the reason for that is because this content is generally created with the goal of basically increasing awareness and proliferation of a particular topic to promote it rather than necessarily informing, which is what these answer engines are really prioritizing. And so, because these answer engines are getting increasingly better at filtering out this anonymous, whether it's AI generated content or even if it's human generated content, but largely pulled from AI or it's very shallow or very generic, these AI engines are increasingly filtering all of that stuff out. So we want to provide some sort of data, in this case, author signals, that help identify our content as coming from a point of expertise. Because these AI systems are weighting that data much heavier than those content articles that aren't. Fifth is content recency. So these AI tools are also always going to prioritize current information. So what that means in practice is inserting visible publication or update dates, and ideally both, into your content. Another thing that I've also seen as being very helpful is even the number of views, trafficked, or traffic clicks to that particular page, because that also informs that this is a source of continuous truth for your audiences. And then finally, well-cited content cites its own sources. And you might think, well, that's kind of contradictory because, well, I thought the whole point of these answer engines is that it's accruing all these sources for me. And yes, that is the case. But if AI engines come across content that itself provides an avenue, a pathway for it to explore based off of relevant related content, it is going to assign that content a higher ranking and weight it heavier because, again, it's providing a structure for later data and other contextual information that it can imagine its users with providing for follow-up queries. Okay. And then the last, I kind of lied a little bit. There's one more seventh characteristic that I want to mention, and like, this might seem like, well, duh, well, of course, wouldn't we always want to do this? But a commonly overlooked thing is that well-cited content has to be useful. And the reason I'm mentioning this explicitly is that, like I said earlier, these AI systems are getting better and better at filtering out irrelevant, shallow content. And so a very common you've probably all heard this at some point, whether it's in an article or even like a speech or whatever someone is giving, they'll start off something like, you know, uh, CRM segmentation isn't this, it's that. And that kind of like AI-based vocabulary and syntax is becoming a key indicator, not just for us, right, as being more used to recognizing in this AI-saturated environment, but it's also a key indicator to these AI engines. Hey, this is probably not unique content, right? This is not original content. This is also probably content that is not entirely, of course, human generated. And so even though like I personally am very aggrieved that the Oxford comma is now a key indicator of AI usage, but it also informs us in terms of when we're creating this content, what behaviors do we need to shift away from that we might have learned in, English 101 class back in college to write a good essay, or, even these SEO strategies and principles that we might have learned previously. All of that has to be shifted in terms of creating original, truly useful content. So again, the takeaway here is that genuine expertise written by someone who actually knows the subject and has something meaningful to contribute is where you should be spending your time. The days of creating a lot of, a great breadth of information, a great breadth of content, for SEO purposes are no longer really relevant in the age of AI. Okay, so I want to pause there. I see that we have a few mentions in the chat. Um, Jerry says, so AEO doesn't like content generated by AI. Yes, and the reason is not only for the reason of there's a lot of, for example, brands and companies that will purchase AI generated content to mass promote particular topics, things like that. Or, for example, for example, in my schooling, a very common thing that we're noticing in educational environments is that AI usage is being used for homework, of course. In fact, if any of you have kids, you may have even experienced this yourself and had to scold them about it, right? But because of that, the syntax, the terminology, the type of vocabulary, and writing structures that you're commonly seeing now, even ones that were previously aligned with effective writing strategies, are no longer being able to be distinguished by these AI engines. So we have to be particularly mindful of how to stay original. So yeah, the answer is yes to your question, Jerry. Carl says, good news for human content creators. Yes, exactly. And so, a common thing that gets, I guess, fear-mongered sometimes is that AI is going to be the death of creativity. And in some cases, there can be some negative effects, of course. I don't want to discount that. But what it also really pushes us as content creators is to even more so prioritize creativity and originality, and of course, depth of expertise, because that's where we can provide unique insights that AI can then pull from in its synthesized answers. So the next section I want to talk about is how do these AI tools actually evaluate content, even if we're using those key indicators from the previous section. So let me take a step back. When you're asking an AI model a question, here's kind of a rough overview of what's happening behind the scenes. So first and foremost, the model is drawing on what it has learned during its training phase, right, pre-launch. And at that time, it's also going to perform what's called a real-time retrieval pass. And so during this pass, what it's doing is pulling current, and that's the key word there, current up-to-date content from the open web that relates to that user's query. And then it's going to synthesize, like I mentioned, the retrieval process, right? Based on its training guidelines, the AI model is performing that retrieval pass, pulling content from the web. And then finally, during the answer synthesis portion, it's basically synthesizing a response, deciding which of those sources to reference and how much weight it's going to assign each one. The reason why it's important to understand this process is because we want to know what actual standards are relevant for us when we're talking about AEO. So there's three particular standards that I want to highlight. The first is accessibility. So in other words, can the AI model's crawler actually read your page, right? Actually read your content? Now, this might seem very basic, and the reason why I'm mentioning it first is because many modern sites are built in ways that make them difficult for AI to parse, right? A very common thing that was we noticed, particularly during, the kind of, COVID boom of technology, is this real heavy prioritization of these flashy single page application websites that are very dynamic. You click something and it does this like fancy animation of like a waterfall gliding over the words, and then it replaces it with, a stream of words that fall down into place perfectly, and it looks very nice and aesthetic. So there is that heavy prioritization of that. The problem is when it comes to these AI engines, is that especially for AI engines that are maybe don't have access to certain web crawlers or particular uh, programming libraries to analyze these websites, it's going to have a bit of a hard time actually, again, accessing those sites. So a very common example is for those developers with us in the chat today, if you've ever built a React-based, React.js single page application, and so all of your content is primarily loaded onto this one page, and every single, page that the user can click on within that website is itself cached or bookmarked into its own separate section. But technically, all the content is just on that one single page. that could potentially be a little bit difficult for an AI engine to fully parse and analyze. So what this means for us is that server-side rendering, whereby you are making sure that the full content that the AI crawler receives is purely within the HTML, right? There's nothing hidden. There's nothing inherently built into the code of your website that will then be rendered pre-HTML. We want to try to avoid those aspects. So basic takeaway, right? If you're not sure where your site stands on this, make sure that you're checking in with your developer team, or if you are a developer, making sure that all your content can be crawled through in your HTML files. Next up is extractability at the section level. Now, this is one of the most important shifts in how AI tools work versus traditional search engines. So these classic search engines are indexing, entire pages or documents. And on the other hand, these AI models are extracting at the section, paragraph, or even the sentence level. So they're really asking which specific section or chunk on this page directly answers that user's question. So what you need to do is think of, well, when I'm talking about my content, does each section and part of my content's pages, is it competing with itself in terms of every single section has relevant, clear, declarative information? Or is it, there's a lot of, exposition, content, contextualization, build up, anecdotes, etc., that can cause an individual page to be at risk of competing more with other sources than with itself. Okay, so that's why well-organized content structure matters so much. Things like FAQ sections or clear data structures like tables and charts. Lastly, the third bar is what's called entity recognition, or in more academic terms, named entity recognition, or NER. So within this, the AI model is trying to figure out what your brand is, what category it belongs to, who its competitors are, what use cases it serves, and a number of those other holistic factors that make up your overall brand. Now, it's building all this understanding by reading both not only what you're saying about yourself, and also what your team members are publishing in other external sources, but it's also what other external people outside of your organization are saying about you as well. So this can include everything from review sites to industry publications. I think someone earlier mentioned Reddit. That's actually a very common place of citations for these AI models, because Reddit is a good representation of well-trafficked and well-engaged with information. Of course, not all of it is accurate, but that's where an AI engine will compare and contrast across other sources on the web. Reddit is still, in that case, a very valuable resource, as with other social media references. So once it's accumulated all this information, the AI model is then triangulating across all of these aggregated sources to, again, construct this holistic profile of your brand. Now, the takeaway here is that the more consistent and substantive that profile is across all these sources, the more confident the model is about how to position you in its synthesized answer rankings. So I'm going to skip over this a little bit for the sake of time. But there's one more standard I do want to briefly mention, and I probably will bring this up again at different points, and that's trust, because trust is a key metric, even though, you might think, well, how do you measure or break down trust into, concrete numerical standards? There are a lot of different ways that this is done, but trust is a key factor in how these AI models are finding the sources for the answers. So things like content recency, well-credentialed authors, these linked citations, and so much more is all what's contributing to building up your trust, so that this AI model is continuously turning to you as a preeminent source for data and other information. So the next section I want to talk about briefly is what practical changes or what tips or tricks you can follow to optimize your content. So in terms, if I'm talking about really high impact content changes, there are six that I want to mention. The first and probably highest impact change is to update the openings of your most important content pages such that they're leading with the answer, then following up with context and other supporting information. Now, again, quick disclaimer. Again, I'm not saying you have to rewrite every single page or, if you have a cooking website, you don't have to take out the anecdotes. That's not necessarily what I mean, about, uncle's ravioli business or whatever. What I'm saying is, let me give you an example. Like I've worked a lot in documentation for developers, for example. And if I were to have to update every single page, that would be extremely time consuming. So my strategy to address something like developer documentation is that I want to identify what are the most concrete, well-trafficked, and pages that have the most traction of this, directory. Now, this could mean things like your highest converting landing pages, your most trafficked blog or documentation posts. Now, because these pages tend to be the most engaged with and contain the most relevant data or information, as of course, as well as being discoverable by these traditional search engines, all these factors are going to benefit their internal rankings in the AI model. So once you've identified the pages you want to focus on, you want to look at the first paragraph of each of those pages. In fact, the first paragraph of each of the sections on those pages and ask, does this answer the user's question directly? Or is it spending a few sentences or even paragraphs warming up and instead just delivering exposition? You want to try to avoid that. So like a quick example is that, let's say you have sample A here. Customer retention is an important part of any growing business. In today's competitive market, companies need to think carefully about how they build a lasting relationship with their customers. Again, nothing necessarily wrong with it, but it's a little generic and it doesn't really make any declarative claims, right? It's very much, it's almost like it's hedging its bets because it's going to provide you more context later on in the article. Now compare that to sample B. Customer retention is the process of keeping existing customers active, satisfied, and continuing to buy from your business. The most effective retention strategies usually focus on onboarding, support quality, product value, customer feedback, and timely follow-ups. Now notice here, this answer, this snippet is significantly more direct, specific, and also self-contained. Like this itself, this paragraph itself, could be the first few sentences that are aggregated by an AI engine because it's grounded in specificity. So the practical takeaway here is, don't just simply, drag the reader and the answer engine along in your articles. You don't want to make them hunt for the answer. You're going to really want to focus on, again, clear, declarative, highly specific responses early on, and then provide the supporting details after the fact. Secondly, fix your headings. Now, this might seem like a very small thing, but for an AI engine, these headings actually are key signposts about what the entirety of the section is going to cover. Because these AI engines, for the sake of optimization, aren't necessarily reading the entirety of every single article or every single directory. They're using strategies to identify these chunks, and one particular strategy is analyzing headings. So you might want to take, for example, if I'm working in developer documentation and these are maybe some headings I might want to use, I want to ground these very vague generalization headings into something that's a little more specific. So overview, for example, could become a summary overview of your CRM's features, or benefits could become the main benefits of customer segmentation. Again, I'm actually providing a clear indicator to these AI engines that align clearly with common queries and questions that our users will probably be asking. Third is trust signals. So you really want to strengthen these trust signals. And what I mean by that is you want to name your most well-engaged pages with everything from named authors to having bios and credentials where relevant. Links to external profiles are highly encouraged because they provide that avenue for AI engines to follow through to provide additional contextual info. And of course, those visible and last updated dates are also very valuable. Fourth is consistent language. Now, this is really important if you have a very tailored brand or product content, Because remember that these AI engines are trying to understand your entities as a whole. Who are you? What category do you fall under? What problems are you solving, etc. All of these questions make up your holistic brand and position you as a source of truth or as something to overlook. Okay, so like I said, pick the specific words you want associated with these areas: category, audience, product, and value proposition. Those are the key areas you really want to be targeting in your content. Fifth is optimizing the substance of your content itself. So this is something that can be often overlooked because, oftentimes formatting edits can feel easier, right? Let me just fix my headings, for example. But remember that part of what factors into an AI model's internal rankings are also the depth of the substance it's analyzing. So again, if your page is generic, rewriting headlines is really only going to help so much. So you want to really look for places where you can add original values. So some common tips I would recommend, you look for places where you can add examples from your own specific work or product, screenshots, graphs, tables, workflows, tutorial videos, because even these AI models can even analyze a video itself. All of these potential unique and again, grounded in personalization to your brand are highly valuable to these AI models to stand apart. Additionally, you want to try to focus on practical implementation or action step details that only someone with your expertise would know. For example, very common, what are common pain points that a user is going to encounter with your product or your services? That's something that only someone who's regularly using your product is likely going to be aware of. And then last but not least, again, this might seem very small, but FAQ formatting is very powerful. And, kind of taking a step out a bit more broadly, any structuring of content that follows this problem solution or question answer formatting tends to do very well in these modern AI models. So, of course, that can look like just adding an FAQ type section, but I do want to caution when you are adding this type of answer question, problem solution type of content is that you don't want to just do it in the sense of, I'm going to build out an FAQ and just include every random question I can think of. You want to additionally format these FAQ type sections in terms of, in the similar way where you're providing in external links for your readers to follow along to provide additional resources. You want to do something very similar with the FAQs. So what I mean by that is if you have question A is, how do I implement, customer segmentation in my CRM? What would be a reasonable follow-up question that a user would have after they ask that initial question? So again, you want to have this kind of flow of a common question process that your user might imagine. And additionally, if you have multiple types of, query processes that your users regularly ask, break down your FAQs into those component parts. Last and one thing I want to mention is you want to think about earned media. So what I mean by that is that a significant part of your AEO is your brand presence across the web. So this can include both your own content as well as external resources that are referencing and citing you. So this can include everything from Google reviews, partner pages, I read a lot of academic articles, so academic publications or citations and, other people's academic publications, customer stories, Yelp reviews, whatever it might be. All of this content is a key metric for building out trustworthiness for your brand presence. Now, again, one more quick disclaimer. I don't want you to get the idea that, if when you're thinking about earned media, I just need proliferation of mentions. So, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go out there to a AI generated provider and I just want to buy 10,000 article mentions about, HubSpot segmentation. Now, this is not going to be beneficial because, again, these AI models are going to overlook shallow content and prioritize depth over breadth. Okay. Now, what I want to do in this next section is I'm actually going to, for the sake of time, I want us to pop over and I'm going to drop this link in the chat. So, alrighty. So I just dropped this link in the chat. So this is our HubSpot AEO Grader tool. So I want to give a few seconds for everyone to navigate here. Now, this AEO Grader tool, now like remember what I just had mentioned earlier is that understanding your holistic brand is a key metric and part of your analysis when you're figuring out how to optimize your content. So of course, I would encourage you fill out this information, but I want to give you an example of what this might look like. So what I've done is I've entered in information related to HubSpot, and in particular, I focused on CRM software services in the technology industry. So what this grader tool does is it looks at the basically most popular AI models, in this case, OpenAI, Perplexity, and Gemini, and it will grade your brand across these different facets. So for example, brand recognition, market score, presence quality, brand sentiment, and share of voice. Now, when you first fill out this AEO grader tool, you will have to sign up with your email. So some shameless email aggregation there. Apologies for that. But once you enter in your email, you'll be provided with a report that looks something like this. Now, the benefit of what I want to highlight here is that this report will break down your brand analysis based off of, well, a number of metrics, but for example, where does where does your brand stand in the overall market position? Or what archetype does your brand occupy in the greater landscape? So in this case, you can see that HubSpot is identified as across all three of these models as being an innovator, right? And in this case, an innovator is a brand that is trying to set itself apart, providing new and unique services to this particular sector, right? Now, what I would recommend when you're analyzing this report across all of these different metrics is identify what are some areas of need where, and I don't want you to think about it as not necessarily scoring highly, but rather if you're seeing, lower end of scores, it simply means that these AI engines are not finding resources and content out there that is addressing those particular areas. So let me show you an example. Where was it? I think there's a 5 out of 10 somewhere that I saw. Yep, right here. So in this case, share a voice, right? HubSpot, according to ChatGPT, is showing some strong answer engine performance, but we want to really make sure that our content is prioritizing, well, where is HubSpot's voice being occurring, right? What types of avenues and mediums is it appearing in? In this case, maybe it's only appearing in the HubSpot knowledge base articles or a HubSpot blog, which is providing a fairly shallow realm of sources to draw from. So again, I recommend analyzing not just your own brand, but also your competitor's brand to compare and contrast. So for the sake of time, I want to pause there. And in the last few minutes, I do want to briefly highlight some things to explore in the AEO tool, but I've been talking for quite a bit. So I want to pause. Are there any quick questions about this AEO grader tool or anything I've mentioned so far? All
Thanks,
right.
Elle. I had a quick question for you. With the showing authority for your content creators, what's the best way to do that? Is that by building that out in a bio on the page? I know you mentioned linking to profiles online, like different social profiles and things. Can you just speak to that? Are there any other things that we should do with our blog templates and author templates and things like that to build that out a little bit more to connect the dots for authority?
Yeah, so this is one of those areas that is, I can give you, I mean, itself can be its own conversation topic. But in terms of some quick action steps I can think of, first and foremost is what are some ways to clearly identify this author's article, or rather, this article's author, as a clear source of expertise. So, for example, what specific role and what specific tasks are they occupying within the organization or business at large? what publications or other external resources has this author provided that provides additional context, even if it's not necessarily content related to this particular article's topic, but gives an understanding to the AI model that, hey, this author is someone who's regularly publishing content that is authoritative and declarative. Additionally, academic articles or other, big industry publications where you can really insert your expertise are highly valuable. So you might have noticed, right? Share a voice here, 5 out of 10 according to ChatGPT. ChatGPT is likely only finding sources related to HubSpot aggregated content. And so in this case, maybe a good strategy for HubSpot is to identify what are some industry partners or publications that could be really useful for us to, instead of, constantly building out all these blog posts just to stick in the knowledge base or our blog, how can we get these posts into external sources of truth, which can then, again, increase the breadth and depth of your content at the same time? Because breadth is still important, like SEO says, but we want it also to be in-depth breadth. Yeah, so I hope that kind of answers your question, but there's a
It
lot of
does.
different attributes you can take
Thank
there.
you. Thank you.
Yeah.
You
I
feel
see
good.
there's something in the chat. So, and we might go a little bit over because I do want to highlight this tool towards the tail end. But let's see. So Scott asks, does the tool include sources like membership required communities, for example, IBM Tech Exchange community, which is locked behind the login? And are AI models able to search such content repositories? So this is where it kind of depends, Scott. If your particular resources are locked behind like a paywall, for example, or some sort of gated login or type of authentication type of directory, in that case, the resources that these answer engines are going to find are likely going to be based off of external sources. So the tool will still work, but it will likely be weighting much heavier external sources rather than your own native resources. So there is that, potential risk. And the second question, are AI models able to search such content repositories? That's a great question. And actually, that's a little bit of a paid question because it perfectly leads to a resource I was going to share in just a bit. So Scott, I'll send you $5 for asking that perfectly placed question later. Appreciate that. But I want to give an example here. Now, this is not necessarily mine, but I've done this quite a lot in my own research in my graduate school program, where a very useful tool, and some of you might even be aware of it, is GitHub, where GitHub is effectively just this directory type of resource for programmers. So I'm going to drop this link in the chat. Now, when you go to that link, you'll notice this is, now again, I haven't created this myself. This is made by someone else, but this is a great aggregated directory of a number of resources related to AEO. And again, like I said, it's referred to by so many different names. So, if you see it mentioned else named elsewhere, don't be alarmed by that. But the reason why this particular type of resource is so valuable is, like I mentioned, it provides a pathway of clear resources to then explore to flesh out a user's query. And it's all in one authoritative article, which weights this particular resource is much higher than, let's say, I think I have a blog post here, than let's say this like random blog post on HubSpot's, blog. So aggregated directories where you have a lot of depth is going to be very, very useful for your organization. So that's why things like developer documentation directories are something that, I work a lot in, and that's something that is very valuable to an AI engine. I hope that might be useful. Alrighty, any other thoughts or questions about this tool or anything else I've mentioned? Yeah, no worries, Asparo, no worries at all. I appreciate you joining with us today. Yeah, no problem, Scott. Appreciate you joining. All right, so we are about at the top of the hour. I know that some folks need to head out. I do want to highlight for those of you who are HubSpot customers to definitely check out the AEO beta on your HubSpot portal. So if you head on over to marketing in your global left-hand navigation bar and then click on AEO, it should be above SEO. Now, mine will look a little bit different than yours. You'll have to fill in some basic information to ground this tool in your specific brand, like your ideal customer profile, your industry, the products you offer, etc. But once you've done that, you'll basically provide it. Let me give you an example. I'm going to go to this fictional business called Fern Baby Fern. And what you'll notice is that I, for example, added in a prompt that I know my users regularly ask and engage with, which is what are the most common needs for those needing houseplants, right? In keeping with this being a plant, botanical business. So the benefit of this tool is it will not only provide you recommendations of how AI is currently analyzing and synthesizing answers based off of content and services you offer, but it would also give you references to citations and other recommendations to further flesh out your content. So I'd highly recommend checking out this tool and a little bit of shameless self-promo here. We're having not only some content created by me being released within the near future, but you'll also be able to find references to HubSpot Academy articles and resources also about AEO in general. So definitely recommend checking out the AEO beta tool in your portal. With that being said, I want to thank all of you for joining. I appreciate you staying a couple minutes over. But for those of you who want to stay a little bit longer and keep us company, if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer those.